Rome, a city shaped by its history, by great achievements in art, music, and religion. The Basilica of St. Peter's is a landmark for the Vatican, the center of Catholicism. In the shadow of the dome is the Sistine Chapel. Built in the late 1400s as the Pope's private chapel, it is also a monument to one of the greatest periods of history, the Renaissance. The Popes commissioned some of the most important artists of the time to decorate the chapel, including Botticelli and Ghirlandaio. But the chapel is most famous for the frescoes of Michelangelo Buonarroti, which adorn its ceiling. Michelangelo illustrated 9 episodes from Genesis, scenes of God forming the universe, the creation of the sun and the moon, the sky and the waters. He also depicted the story of Adam and Eve. In one panel, Eve emerges from Adam's rib at God's command. In another panel, Adam and Eve are tempted by the serpent, and for their sin, they are expelled from the Garden of Eden. But it is Michelangelo's creation of Adam that is considered one of the most important images in the history of Western art. The painting embodies the ideals of the Renaissance: faith in human intelligence, reverence for physical beauty, and belief in spiritual perfection. This scene has become the universal symbol of creativity. In just 4 years, between 1508 and 1512, Michelangelo painted more than 200 figures. He was a controversial choice as the artist to paint the chapel. He was just 33 years old, and this was his first major project in fresco, painting directly into wet plaster. Yet, when his work was revealed, it was a triumph. A contemporary wrote, "There is no other work to compare with this for excellence, nor could there be. This work contains every perfection." Today, almost 500 years later, this work is still seen as one of the great masterpieces, but unfortunately, it has suffered the ravages of time. In 1980, the Vatican announced that Michelangelo's frescoes, including the lunettes just below the ceiling, were in serious danger. Centuries of dirt, smoke from candles and oil lamps, as well as pollution, had contributed to their deterioration. A team of art historians and conservation experts for the Vatican decided the frescoes would have to undergo a major cleaning and restoration. The team estimated the project would take 12 years and cost almost $4 million. Soon after the work was started, Nippon Television Corporation of Japan offered $3 million in exchange for the exclusive film and publishing rights. The first stage of the project, the restoration of the lunette frescoes, took 4 years. By 1984, as the scaffolding was erected to reach the ceiling frescoes more than 65 feet above the floor, the project began to attract world attention. Questions were raised. Should these masterpieces be touched? And would the restoration itself bring any harm to the work? After months of negotiation, Nova was able to secure the rights to film the restoration team as they worked on the panel of the creation of Eve. It soon became evident why so much attention had been focused on this project. As the restorers cleaned the surface, vivid colors appeared: blues, greens, yellows, and reds. colors which had never been associated with Michelangelo's work. The result is a Sistine Chapel that no one had expected.
After we began the restoration and we saw those colors coming out under the soot, under the grime, all of us were shocked, I would say. Nobody expected those colors. Our art historians did not expect it. We knew that there must have been good colors there, but not to such extent. I said surprised, but at the same time we realized that those were the only colors really possible at that time. So after a while, we understood that we should not have expected anything else.
Excited by the results of the restoration, the Vatican began releasing photographs comparing the unclean frescoes and the cleaned frescoes. But not everyone was enthusiastic. The difference between the images was so dramatic, it raised concern among a small but prominent circle of artists and art historians. Ronald Feldman, owner of an art gallery in New York City, was so concerned that he made a special trip to Rome to see the restoration for himself.
I had visited the chapel and I saw some of the restoration in progress, and it disturbed me. I couldn't tell if I was right or wrong, but it did seem to me intuitively that something was wrong with the restoration. Too bright, too cartoon-like. When I came back to the States, photographs started to appear in magazines, and it looked yet worse than when one sees it in person. So I called several artists to get their opinion, just to see if my eyes were alone or whether I had any company, and I found that virtually everyone I called felt the same way. From looking at the reproductions, everyone was disturbed, felt uneasy. Something is missing, some very special touch, some slight element is now gone. And if that is true, then it's gone forever. We never can put it back. It's very hard to argue this point with people who feel that it looks better now, and that it's more beautiful, and that it has more presence than it had before, and that this is the way it should look.
Feldman initiated a petition calling for a pause in the restoration until more evaluation and research could be done. It was signed by 14 well-known American artists, including the sculptor George Segal.
I kept remembering what I loved about Michelangelo's drawings. He would draw as if a form was beginning to emerge from the page, and there was soft smudging and this rolling set of hills and rhythms that described anatomy from, say, your neck to your belly, was this marvelous undulating landscape. And he has a way of doing that kind of shading with incredible sensitivity, so that there's this blending, and somehow you feel convinced that here is this magical form emerging from some kind of darkness. Now, Leonardo was masterful at that same kind of thing. And the Renaissance is famous not for color, but for the emergence of form perceived by the human eye in the real world.
The restoration seemed to challenge this traditional view, and some art historians began offering a new interpretation. Professor Kathleen Wild-Garris-Brandt is an expert in Renaissance art at New York University's Institute of Fine Arts and a consultant to the Vatican.
Seeing Michelangelo as he is being revealed now is a tremendous shock to everybody, because he has entered into the consciousness of our culture as a dark, gloomy, romantic artist, because in fact the chapel, the ceiling, became dark very early in its history. So it's entirely natural that the shock would express itself for some people by saying, well, Michelangelo must have intended to be the way we have always known him, and who find it difficult to accept the new Michelangelo.
Everyone agrees that Michelangelo was a master at depicting the human form. The debate, however, centers on how he painted the figures in the chapel. Trained in sculpture as well as painting, Michelangelo had studied anatomy and was dedicated to articulating every contour of the human body. For the Sistine Chapel, he made numerous sketches, in most cases working from live models in a studio. Michelangelo achieved a sculptural three-dimensional effect in his drawings through the subtle shading of light and dark, an effect known as chiaroscuro. But how did he achieve the same effect in his paintings for the chapel? Many art historians have assumed that Michelangelo used dark tones to give depth and form to his figures and to create a somber, emotional atmosphere. He was deemed a master at representing the human form more through shading with tones than through the use of brilliant color. But is this traditional interpretation correct, or has the restoration indeed given us a new Michelangelo? This question raised many others. What did these frescoes look like originally? What techniques were used to paint them? And what were Michelangelo's real intentions? As the Vatican restoration team found, these questions were not easily answered. Almost 5 centuries have passed, and the images are not only dirty, their original appearance has been altered as a result of previous restorations. It's believed that just 6 years after the frescoes were finished, cleaners were hired to dust the ceiling. Dr. Fabrizio Mancinelli is curator for the Vatican Museums and director of the current restoration. He and Professor Brandt are evaluating the condition of the paintings with Gianluigi Colalucci, chief restorer for the Vatican. They are looking at one of the nude figures called Ignudi, which are part of the Creation of Eve panel. Light directed across the fresco highlights the surface, which shows evidence of the repairs made by previous restorers, including these metal braces, which were used to reattach sections of the loosened plaster. The dark areas indicate the presence of a varnish made from animal glues. This varnish covers most of the ceiling, and the team found indications that it too had been applied by early restorers. The application appears haphazard and does not always follow the shape of the figure. When the glue varnish was first applied, it would have been transparent. As it aged, it became darker. Now the difference between the areas covered with glue varnish and areas not covered is more evident. Because it covers cracks, losses of paint, and metal braces, the restorers concluded that it was applied long after Michelangelo finished his paintings. So they felt it was safe to remove the glue varnish as part of the overall cleaning effort. The figure of Adam demonstrates why this decision was made. These white spots indicate places where fragments of paint have been pulled off as the glue varnish contracts and expands with changes in temperature and humidity. Over time, this has caused considerable damage, as Colalucci explains.
The glue has pulled off bits of color, very small bits in this particular place, but in other areas damage is much more extensive and also much more threatening to the stability of the color layer. Therefore, the glue should absolutely not remain on the frescoes because it was not meant to be there originally.
But why not just repair the damaged areas? Why take the dramatic step of removing the glue varnish from the entire surface?
We could have corrected with some watercolor so that from the floor you couldn't notice those specks, but you would not save the frescoes that way. Because if you had those specks now, tomorrow you could have specks, which means color pigment pulled out in many other places, and slowly the fresco could be destroyed. So it wasn't a question of patching up here and there, it was a question of doing something permanently saving the frescoes.
Removal of the glue varnish has become the major focus of the controversy, because critics contend it may have been applied by Michelangelo himself to achieve the sculptural effects he is known for. This argument has been put forth by another expert in Renaissance art. At Columbia University, Professor James Beck.
My biggest reservation about the restoration of the Sistine ceiling is that the restorers have, since 1980, when they began, they have been removing layers of paint and of veils of tonality, veils of applications, sizing, and glue that Michelangelo himself applied, along with restored portions by later people. But Michelangelo's own applications are being and have been removed.
How did Michelangelo paint the chapel? It's known that his basic approach was a standard technique called buon fresco, which is still taught at places like this international conservation organization in Rome. The chief conservator is Paul Schwartzbaum, now with the Guggenheim Museum. He explains what has been learned from the restoration about Michelangelo's technique.
We're going to try and make a reproduction, if you will, to recreate the working technique of Michelangelo, the way he painted the frescoes of the Sistine ceiling. We're going to use the same materials, and we're going to try as best we can to, we're not Michelangelo, but to recreate his working technique. The materials that you see on the floor, we know from analysis, these are the materials that Michelangelo used to make his plaster.
The plaster is made from lime, water, and a brown volcanic ash called pozzolana. These are mixed into a smooth violet-colored paste. The plaster is applied to a surface prepared the day before called the oricio. This fresh, wet layer, the intonaco, is applied just before painting.
The word fresco in Italian means fresh. And what it means is that we're painting on the fresh plaster. The painter was obliged to work before the plaster dried. Now, this means that the plaster could only be applied little by little as the painter worked in terms of what he thought he might finish in a day or before lunch or what have you. There's a word in Italian which is called the giornata. We know from the cleaning of the Sistine that the colors are very, very bright, and Michelangelo wanted these bright colors. To do that, we see that in certain areas he put on, at the very end, just before he painted, a very bright white, more white, let's say, very, very, very thin layer of preparation, but very rich in lime. Very thin. It would be a millimeter or two thick, what he's putting on now, like a sheet of paper.
After the plaster is applied, the design is transferred using cartoons, drawings on paper. The contours of the figure are incised into the wet plaster, sometimes using a piece of wood. A different technique is used to outline the details around the face.
The other technique is called spolvero in Italian, and probably called a pouncing technique in English. We make a series of small holes along the lines in certain very key points. Michelangelo, we see, did the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the ears, the throat, and then takes a little sack of charcoal or some powdered pigment, and then you'll see the pigment goes through the holes and leaves the design on the fresco, so he has something to use as a guide for painting. Okay, let's take it on. You see, that would be how Michelangelo transferred his design. And with that, it gives you a base for painting.
Michelangelo mixed ground pigments with water. He used just 7 colors derived from minerals found in earthen clays. For his greens, he used green earth, ochres for his yellows and reds, and cobalt or lapis lazuli for the blues. When Michelangelo applied the colors to the wall, they had a translucent quality, like watercolor. But as the plaster dried, a process called carbonation took place. Carbon dioxide in the air combined with the lime in the plaster to form a hardened rock-like surface of calcium carbonate. As a result of this process, the pigment particles were cemented in place, becoming a part of the wall.
Standard fresco technique is a rather stable technique. When it's done well, it lasts thousands of years. We have Roman frescoes that are close to 2,000 years old.
But did Michelangelo vary the standard technique in any way, embellish it perhaps by adding any other layers of paint or glue varnish to the surface of the fresco? Unfortunately, there is no complete record of Michelangelo's working technique. In letters to his family, he did write about painting the chapel, but he mostly complained of the uncomfortable working conditions. In front, my skin grows loose and long. My head is bent back on my shoulders, and my paintbrush drips a rich mosaic onto my face. There are several eyewitness accounts, one written by his pupil, Ascanio Condivi, and another by the artist Giorgio Vasari. In Lives of the Artists, Vasari wrote that Michelangelo was determined to do the frescoes by himself, allowing no one on the scaffolding to see the work except Pope Julius II. Vasari also wrote that Michelangelo was under such pressure from the Pope to complete the ceiling that he didn't have time to add the finishing touches, such as gold leaf. From other documents, it's known that Michelangelo's paintings suffered almost from the moment they were completed. The chapel had been built 30 years before Michelangelo began his work. Despite its fortress-like structure, the foundation was unstable. As the building shifted and settled, cracks opened up in the ceiling. An architect's illustration shows that the original design for the vault was a sky gilded with stars. But after the cracks appeared, the ceiling needed repair, and Michelangelo was hired to repaint the chapel. A document from 1543, just 30 years after Michelangelo finished, shows that the building had become so dirty that cleaners were hired to dust the paintings. This was probably the result of the burning of candles, oil lamps, and charcoal heaters. More serious problems were noted in a letter written in 1547 by a contemporary of Michelangelo's. Apparently, cracks again had opened up in the ceiling, allowing rainwater to seep in. White spots appeared on the paintings, and as the letter states, it was feared that the paintings were being consumed by saltpeter and cracks. It was to cover this damage that Paul Schwartzbaum believes early restorers applied the glue varnish to the ceiling.
We know that very early in the life of these paintings, the roof leaked. With the rainwater percolating, if you will, through the masonry and through the plaster, it brought soluble salts with it, and also insoluble salts, or slightly soluble salts, which evaporated on the surface of the paintings in certain places and formed a white veil, obscuring the colors. To make this opaque white veil more transparent, to be able to make it look more luminous, to be able to see through it, if you will, the restorers added glue. This acted almost like a varnish. It made this opaque veil more transparent. Now, unfortunately, glue is a material which ages. It's organic, it oxidizes, it turns dark. It also goes opaque. So this glue treatment would render it transparent for a while, and then the next generation would have the same problem, and therefore more glue was added.
This is the theory held by the Vatican to explain the glues. But did early restorers leave any documents that would confirm it? The Vatican conducted a search through what are called the secret archives, a repository of papers and records dating back to the first pope. Two art historians, Edith Cicerchia and her colleague Anna Maria de Strobel, looked through the archives for more than a year. These and other records did not confirm whether earlier restorers used glues, but they did prove that at least 6 restorations had taken place.
This is the first document that we found, and it says that the paintings of the chapel, which were very dusty, were cleaned by a restorer called Simone Laghi, using linen cloth and bread. We have been very lucky because we found a very precise record on an important restoration of the chapel that was done in the beginning of the 18th century. We know now that the chapel was restored between September 1710 and finished in December 1712. And the painter who did the restoration was Annibale Mazzoli. He was a painter from Siena, and this is something that we didn't know before. It was absolutely unknown. On this side, the accounts are extremely precise. Here we have all the payments the painter had in several months, and here are all his expenses. What is very important also about this document is that we know the technique that the painter used in cleaning the chapel. The chapel was cleaned using Greek wine and sponges. How do we know that? Because we have here all the expenses that the painter had, and he says that he has to be paid for all that except for the Greek wine and the sponges which were given by the Vatican Palace.
The historical documents are only of limited help, so the work itself is the major source for understanding how Michelangelo painted his frescoes and what has been added to the surface. To distinguish Michelangelo's original work from the repairs which have been made, restorers take samples from the surface of the paintings. Each panel is different. Each has its own set of problems and unique history. Every time the scaffolding is moved, the restorers spend about 1 month evaluating the condition of the frescoes before any cleaning is begun. In some areas, as Colalucci points out, early restorers actually painted over the original frescoes.
The problems here are many. There are several layers of glue, but there are also many brush strokes that we can see here which were applied by past restorers. That is, later overpaintings, which served to reinforce all the shadows which were hidden as the ceiling darkened with the passing of time.
In this particular case, samples are taken from the surface to verify whether the brushstrokes for the shadows belong to the early restorers or to Michelangelo. The Vatican's own conservation laboratory analyzes the samples in several ways. Each sample is divided into 2 parts. One is held for chemical analysis, while the other is used to make a cross-section. An acrylic mold is prepared to receive the tiny sample. These fragments are often no larger than the head of a pin. The frescoes are irreplaceable, so the size and number of samples must be limited. After the mold is allowed to dry overnight, a section is removed. For the creation of Eve panel, the laboratory prepared more than 130 samples. The lab examines the cross-sections under quartz light and takes photographs. This photograph shows a series of layers. The lighter bottom layer is the plaster of the intonaco. The yellow layer is pigment. Then dirt, glue, and above the glue, a darker layer of overpainting. The lab is most interested in the layers above the fresco's surface, so it takes photographs of the cross-sections under ultraviolet light. The layer of glue fluoresces blue. The dirt layer between the layer of glue and the pigment now shows up as these dark, irregular particles. Because this layer of dirt lies between the fresco's surface and the glue, the lab concluded that the glue could not have been applied by Michelangelo because it was not applied directly to the surface. Anything above the layer of dirt, such as glue and overpaintings, they reasoned, would have been added by restorers. These cross-sections have become the Vatican's most valuable tool in reconstructing a history, a kind of logic of layers of what was added to the surface of the paintings. Although cross-sections are useful and considered standard practice in art conservation, they are not a definitive scientific test. There is no precise way of dating the glue and dirt layers, so the lab cannot provide an exact date for when they occurred. And the Vatican has not yet published a full record of its laboratory data. For these reasons, critics challenge the Vatican's conclusion about the glue. In March of 1987, an article appeared written by Alexander Elliott, a former art critic for Time magazine. He claimed some of the glues applied to the paintings belonged to Michelangelo.
Now, my position is that he began, yes, with alfresco painting. That was a bright-colored underpainting, which he then veiled over with many, many glazes to create differences of light value, differences of tone. And in this way, modeled his forms and modeled them again and modeled them again, so they became extremely third-dimensional. And then created even atmosphere by very, very delicate shades and hues, transparent colors. I've seen all this from very close up, and it's there, I believe.
Elliott visited the chapel both before the restoration and during the cleaning. His observations convinced him that Michelangelo used toning layers, pigments or charcoal mixed with glue to create shadows and to give the figures depth and form. Other critics agreed.
I was aware of photographs that were coming from the Vatican, published widely about the restoration. I looked at those photographs very carefully, and I soon became convinced, especially when discussing the matter with contemporary artists, that something was being taken away from the surface. I became more and more concerned. I then went again to the chapel, both from below and from above, and those experiences confirmed that they were actually taking surface away that was made by Michelangelo. In order to perhaps indicate something of what has gone on, we can only use photographs and illustrations that are officially released by the Nippon Television Corporation and by the Vatican. And in this figure, you can see very clearly, without any doubt at all, that they have removed surface modeling. The shoulder has all but disappeared. It's a flat shoulder, and it is very uncharacteristic of Michelangelo. It is very uncharacteristic of the before, where you see this light modeling. Here you have still the sense that that shoulder exists and that it is a modeled, muscular object. It's still Michelangelo somewhere, but they have changed it to such an extent that it is no longer a direct reflection of his intention.
The criticism seemed to have little impact. Having decided initially that Michelangelo did not apply toning layers, the restorers had developed a cleaning method to remove the glue and overpaintings without disturbing the fresco underneath. Distilled water is often used to clean frescoes, but when the restorers examined the lunette frescoes, they found whitish veils called salt efflorescences beneath the dirt and glues. These are the result of water damage from the leaking roof. Over time, the salts formed an incrustation with the dirt and glues and required more than distilled water to remove them. Tests were done on the lunettes using a chemical cleaning agent called AB57, and a procedure was developed. First, the fresco surface is washed with distilled water. Then, AB57, which contains a number of chemicals suspended in a gel, is applied to a section of the fresco. The solution dissolves the salts and swells the glue. To be safe, the agent is left on for no more than 3 minutes. The fresco is rinsed thoroughly with distilled water. This rinsing is crucial. The chemicals are powerful enough to damage the fresco if left on for too long. The restorers use a second and sometimes third application of the cleaning agent where the salts or glues are particularly thick. Various forms of AB57 have been used on frescoes for the past 15 years. It is considered a safe method as long as the time the chemicals come in contact with the surface is carefully monitored. The lab periodically filters the rinse water from the cleaning. Since they know what pigments Michelangelo used, they can, in theory, be sure they're not removing any of his work. Not every bowl of water is analyzed. and this method only detects significant pigment losses. Still, the lab says it has not found evidence of Michelangelo's pigments in any of the samples. The restorers also devote a great deal of time to the task of repairing the fresco wall. Using an infrared camera to detect the surface below the dirt and glue, the restorers look for areas of previous restorations. In areas where the plaster has pulled away from the supporting wall, they inject an acrylic resin which acts as an adhesive. This is done only in places where detachments have occurred. Cracks are filled with stucco made of lime and marble powder. The area is etched to indicate that this is a restored portion. A guiding principle of this restoration is to make repairs which are visible and can be easily removed. In areas where the frescoes have suffered permanent damage, restorers cover the paint losses with watercolor. The rest of the fresco is only cleaned. These in-paintings are made in parallel lines, so that from close up the repairs are evident, while from a distance the fresco appears complete. The restoration of the 14 lunette panels was finished in 4 years, but when work began on the ceiling frescoes, the restorers discovered Michelangelo occasionally used a technique they did not find on the lunettes, a technique that involved the use of glue called a secco.
Secco means dry. It means working on the dry plaster. When you work on the fresh plaster, you don't need a binder, because it's the reaction of the lime itself, the formation of the crystals of calcium carbonate that traps and binds the pigment. Instead, secco, you need to mix the pigment with something. Otherwise, if someone goes afterwards and rubs their hand over it, it falls off. And people normally mix the pigment either with glue or egg, either the white or the red or both, or casein, a glue made from cheese, or they could even mix it with lime and paint on the dry plaster.
The Vatican restorers believe Michelangelo used this technique when he needed to make corrections to his figures on the ceiling, probably due to the curved nature of the vault. Professor Brandt explains.
When Michelangelo removed the cartoon, he realized occasionally, very occasionally, that he had to make what are called in Italian pentimenti, rethinkings, corrections, usually around the contour of his figure. The reason for that is that if you take a flat piece of paper and you apply it to a curved vault like this, naturally it's going to be necessary afterwards to make some visual adjustments. So now he takes his secco paint, that is to say with the glue binder so it will stick to the plaster, and here you see he enlarges the form. This fresco has not been touched. It is uncleaned, and yet with the naked eye, already before cleaning, we are able to identify those secchi, and we also see what their function was. That is to say, to correct a contour rather than to be a layer over the entire painting.
Before any cleaning is begun, the laboratory must distinguish Michelangelo's corrections made with glue from the overpaintings of the early restorers. Dr. Nazareno Gabrielli, chief chemist for the lab, evaluates photographs taken of the frescoes. He shows one of the restorers, Pier Giorgio Bonetti, an ultraviolet photograph of the Ignudo figure. The areas that show up white, almost yellow, like the eye and the hands, indicate thicker applications of glue. These areas could either be a correction by Michelangelo or an overpainting by an early restorer. The restorers look at these areas closely. The photographs will help determine how to proceed with the cleaning. Some areas can be recognized immediately. The crack through Eve's arm, which appears yellow, was probably filled in with wax, a standard technique in restoration. Any paint applied over the crack would have been applied by restorers. The lab can also analyze samples taken from these areas using an atomic absorption spectrograph. This instrument vaporizes the sample and in the process identifies individual elements. For example, in a sample taken from one of the nude figures from the creation of Eve, the analysis shows the presence of zinc, which was only used in pigments after 1800. the lab knows that this sample must have come from an overpainting made by restorers. Although the lab relies on pigment analysis, ultraviolet photographs, and cross-sections to distinguish Michelangelo's glue from that of his restorers, there is no definitive method of separating one layer from another. So when the restorers suspect an area to be Michelangelo's work, such as here in the face of Adam, or when they find areas still in doubt, they cover the area with an acrylic resin called paraloid B72. Paraloid protects the underlying pigments and glue, which could be destroyed by the cleaning agent or water. The surrounding area can be cleaned without disturbing the sake. Afterwards, the paraloid is dissolved using a solution absorbed into rice paper. The sake is cleaned separately using a solution which does not contain water. But whether they're cleaning the sake or the buon fresco portion, the success of the procedure relies on the judgment and skill of the restorer, and this concerns some critics.
This layer that is on top, this dirty layer, is very, very thin. And so how much chemical is applied and when one should stop the chemical process, that's what they test, and they look at the patches. And it's absolutely, I think, impossible to do it with the eye alone. And reading the scientific information that they get is something that we would like to try our hand at. We would at least like to see it and tell how much of this is judgment. If it's judgment, then the world has to know that this is a judgment call.
We know that in the future, the techniques will be better than they are now. That is sort of built into our society, that we know that there are going to be new methods, new techniques, new procedures that will be more effective. Let's wait. Then there's no more discussion.
Wait for what? A disease is present now. We should intervene. I don't see what we should wait for. We have the means to do it now, the technical tools. There's no reason to wait.
In response to the criticism, an American Conservation Foundation sponsored a trip of 6 art conservators to the Sistine Chapel. Andrea Rota, conservator of paintings at the J. Paul Getty Museum in California, was among the group.
We looked for very explicit details that would give us an indication of something that was done right or wrong. And the general consensus was that the surface looked beautiful and that there was no sign of abrasion that had been done recently. There were lots of indications of previous abrasions which are visible even in those parts which are unclean. In my experience as a conservator, there is no black and there is no white. There is no absolute consensus in anything, or there is no perfection. But there are the right things and there are the wrong things. And I feel that the Sistine Chapel conservation has been done with all the due care. I mean, they have done the scientific preparation they needed to do. They have done the analysis, they have tested the surface, they have analyzed the pigments, they have done what they could, which was necessary to know. One could go on endlessly analyzing something to death, and the results would always be the same.
Conservators evaluate the work of other conservators according to the technical standards of their profession. They also work closely with art historians to interpret the techniques used by the artist. Professor Brandt has looked at the clean frescoes and believes that color was essential to the creation of Michelangelo's forms.
This is one of the areas where Michelangelo concentrates his use of brilliant, changing color. We can see just how Michelangelo got this shimmering effect by using 3 colors. He started with a basic, you can see it here too, with a basic golden tone, waited for a moment until that sank in, then put his brush into a very liquid solution of the next color, violet, then did like this with the brush so that the hairs of the brush stood out like that, then applied the next tone, the violet, on top of the yellow, let that soak in for a moment, and then finally the highlights with white went on top of that to create these extraordinary effects of color modeling, by which I mean that he uses two bright colors to represent light and shade, in this case violet and yellow with white highlights, rather than taking one color, say like yellow, and then getting a sense of roundness and volume by shading down with browns. There are also other remarkable things about the color. You can see that Michelangelo really built up his flesh tones in very delicate cross-hatchings, rather the way he does in drawings, actually. I don't know if you can really see it here, but you can see brushstrokes of hair-like delicacy that cross each other. And that means that when you look from below, you really just see this beautiful annealed, pearl-like surface, really.
But this view will be debated long after the restoration is complete, especially by those who say that the images don't fit with the traditional interpretations of Michelangelo.
No, I don't like the way they look. No, I don't. No, I think they look wrong. It's not, I mean, I wouldn't get into the issue of how much I like or dislike Michelangelo either. It doesn't fit into anything of the work in which we know is his and that has not been manipulated. That is the drawings, that is especially the sculpture, that is a limited amount of the painting from before the restoration, where we have photographs, we can see what was on there. And these don't look like him. They're not modeled that way. And I think that it is not so much, although there is an aesthetic element about it, I don't like the way they look. They look wrong. Not ugly, they look wrong. See, that's different than aesthetics in terms of saying, I think they're ineffective and they're a violation of his intention.
Although much of the controversy surrounding this restoration has focused on questions about when the glues were applied, ironically, the glue may have served a protective function. It's possible that the glues kept moisture and pollutants from attacking the fresco's surface directly. The restorers faced a difficult question. To what extent will this intervention bring about new dangers to the work? In the past 20 years, air pollution has become a serious problem in Rome. Emissions from cars and factories are causing the rapid deterioration of monuments and buildings throughout the city. What effect could these pollutants have on the newly cleaned and unprotected frescoes? Dr. Giorgio Taraka.
Well, the frescoes are always in danger, unless you can create around them a very stable environment. But a stable environment is a very rare thing on the surface of the earth. Furthermore, there are a lot of visitors, and the visitor, by walking into the chapel and looking at the paintings, can produce an average of 50 grams of water per hour. If you think every visitor stays 15 minutes and that there are about 6,000 visitors per day, you come to about 75 kilograms of water produced in each day in the Sistine Chapel. That means there is a lot of humidity around in hours of the day and a lot of change of temperature, so there may be condensation and other processes like that. In that condition, the painting would deteriorate if it is not protected.
The Vatican commissioned a study. For 3 days and nights during each of the 4 seasons, the effects of light, temperature, and humidity inside the chapel were monitored. The results indicated that dramatic changes inside the chapel contributed to problems for the frescoes. The chapel has windows which open to the outside, allowing gases from air pollution to enter. But it's how they react with the chapel's own microclimate that is important. During the day, hundreds of visitors enter the chapel. The crowds track in dirt, and their presence heats up the air and adds to the humidity inside. The warm, moist air rises to the top of the vault, where it cools and sinks back down to the floor. This cyclical airflow continues, depositing dirt and moisture on the ceiling and walls, as long as people are in the chapel. When the chapel empties at closing time, the air cools and the air currents slow down. Moisture condenses on the wall surface. It's this moisture in combination with environmental pollutants and dust which create a danger to the frescoes.
The humidity brought in by the visitors could be dangerous for the frescoes. And that we know very well, that humidity a high relative humidity is dangerous because the humidity brings into the pores of the frescoes those particles that may still be existing in the atmosphere. So we had a choice, either to keep the visitors out or to keep the visitors in and do something to the environment.
The Vatican contacted Carrier Corporation to design a special climate control system. An engineering team was assembled at Delchi Carrier in Milan. The engineers recommended that the windows be sealed off. A system would be installed to pump only clean and filtered air into the chapel, and the temperature of the air would be controlled to prevent condensation on the frescoes. This system will, in theory, maintain a stable environment, but it will take years before it is known whether it alone can reduce the danger to the now unprotected frescoes.
We human beings accept risk every day in our life. And it's right, that is part of life. And so should be the works of art. A minimum risk. And it's our duty, of course, to protect the work of art the best way we can. But still, we got to accept a minimum percentage of risk.
Unlike their predecessors, this restoration team has been careful to document their working procedures for the benefit of future restorers, who may one day have to care for these works. Using a graphic computer system, the restorers document the problems, like the cracks found in the creation of Eve, and the methods used to correct them. But one of the other benefits of documenting the restoration is what has been learned about Michelangelo's working techniques. In the creation of Eve, the green lines delineate a day's work, the giornate. By studying the way the panels overlap, the restorers have learned that Michelangelo started first with Adam's face in the lower left. In all, it took 4 sessions to complete the panel. The restorers plan to complete their work on the ceiling frescoes by 1989. The project is certain to draw even more attention when the restorers begin the final stage. More than 20 years after Michelangelo painted the ceiling and lunettes, he returned to paint the wall behind the altar, an enormous floor-to-ceiling fresco of the Last Judgment. By this time, his style had changed, and the mood of the times was different. Some art historians have assumed that Michelangelo intended the atmosphere to be dark, to reflect a somber spiritual statement. He painted tormented individuals grouped together, twisting and climbing in a desperate attempt to reach heaven. This fresco presents a special problem for the restorers. When Michelangelo finished the painting, he was accused of indecency and sacrilege. Other artists were hired to paint clothing on his realistically painted nudes. But many of the changes were made not just by painting over the figures, but by cutting out and replacing portions of the fresco. Removing these overpaintings would leave large gaps in the fresco, and it would also mean removing a part of history. Michelangelo wrote, "Nothing makes the soul so religious and pure as the endeavor to create something perfect, and whoever strives after perfection is striving for something divine." The restoration of the Sistine Chapel has brought us to a crossroads. Will future generations find the same perfection in the paintings as generations before? Or will the restoration of one of the great masterpieces of Renaissance art change forever the way we think of its creator?